Hi everybody, and thanks so much for coming out. What I'd like to do this evening is talk about a very particular kind of very tall building, the hotel. Now, in my book, I describe hotels as hospitality machines, and here I'm of course riffing on Cass Gilbert's famous phrase that a skyscraper is a machine that makes the land pay. What I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you about the particular economic imperatives that drove the architectural form of hotels and which eventually led to the emergence of a now well-established building type, the skyscraper hotel. Now, hotels are of course a kind of commercial architecture. They're shaped by their role as purveyors of commercial hospitality, that is, of selling shelter by the day. And it's the work of accommodating people that determines both their architectural form and their social norms. But the influence of hotels actually extended far beyond the purely commercial realm. In my book, I describe how the architectural form and social practices that developed in the hotel have shaped everything in the United States, from political life to urban housing to civil rights law. Today, though, the basic idea I'm going to want to elaborate on is the idea that the architecture of commercial hospitality involved a gradual breaking apart of the architecture of domesticity. That is, a disaggregation and a scaling up of the spaces of the home. And when we study the emergence of very tall hotels, we can also see something else, and that is an alternative path to the emergence of another very kind of very tall structure, the apartment building. From their first emergence in the 1790s, hotels had always been quite large. Indeed, the distinction between inns and taverns on one side and hotels on the other was really a matter of financing, corporate ownership, size, and the fact that they were architecturally distinct, right? Taverns and inns had not been in any real way distinguishable from residences, right? Which is why they had to have those standard hanging tavern signs. But hotels, from their very first generation, were already some of the largest buildings in their cities. So, for example, the Union Public Hotel in Washington, D.C., which was begun in 1794, was rivaled in size only by the Capitol and the White House. By the same token, the Boston Exchange Coffee House of 1809 was said to be the most expensive and tallest building in Boston. And indeed, within a decade or so after that, the basic form of the hotel had emerged. In images like these, you can see that buildings that were built about 200 years ago look, in a sense, pretty familiar to us, recognizable as hotels. Right? By the 1850s, hotels had grown even larger, occupied entire city blocks, but noticeably, for decades after, hotels did not really become super tall until the 1890s, right? Through the 1880s, none of the tallest hotels was in fact over 10 stories. Now, the 1890s saw firsts, right? The Savoy completed in 1892 at 10 stories, then the Netherlands, which opened its doors the following year at 17 stories. And indeed, the Netherlands remained the tallest of its kind until 1900. And as we'll see a little bit later, I'm going to save the sort of introduction of the skyscraper hotel for a little bit later, but it's only after 1900 that we see the emergence of hotels that are unmistakably super tall. Now, the size and the height of hotels were governed by some of the same considerations as other buildings, right? The price of real estate, the strength and the cost of steel. But what I think is key here is that their internal arrangement was shaped far more, by considerations that had everything to do with the specifics of providing commercial hospitality. Hotels reorganized architectural space by breaking the household apart, disaggregating its spaces and functions, and reconfiguring them into a new kind of plan. A house or dwelling is simply a collection of spaces that correspond to the needs or wants of the people who occupy it. So, to take just one example, in this townhouse designed by Asher Benjamin, each function was given its own space. A kitchen for cooking, a dining room for eating, parlors for entertaining, and bedchambers for sleeping. Different uses were sometimes located on different floors, but all of them were grouped together for the exclusive use of a single family. But when Americans built hotels to replace inns and taverns, they transformed the architecture of hospitality. Hotel builders began with the basic functional spaces of the household, but dramatically altered their arrangement and their scale. And indeed, you can see the same spatial organization I'm going to describe in Asher Benjamin's Exchange Coffee House, Isaiah Rogers' Tremont House, and hotels going really into and through the 20th century, as we'll see in a bit. The most dramatic redistribution of household space involved the sleeping areas, which were greatly multiplied in number and placed side by side in the form of dozens or ultimately hundreds of hotel bedchambers. Now, these guest rooms were individuated private spaces that were separated from the more public functions of the hotel by being placed on upper floors or in separate wings. They were not, however, as private as house bedrooms because they opened directly onto circulating hallways. The other functions of the household underwent a very different transformation. They were greatly amplified in size and capacity so they could be used in common by the hotel's numerous guests. So, enormous kitchens were outfitted with hypertrophied stoves, ovens, and sinks, and served customers in huge common dining halls with long tables and scores of chairs. Centralized laundries collected, washed, ironed, and folded clothing for numerous hotel guests, and similarly, family-sized halls and parlors of the private household expanded into sitting rooms and lounges big enough to accommodate large groups. Reading rooms became libraries, porches became verandas, hallways became galleries. And these more public areas, I should emphasize, usually remained together, arranged on the lower floors of a hotel where they were shared by guests and locals alike. Hotel design also involved changes in the spatial distribution and organization of labor. Hotel space created a clear and systematic separation of living space from workspace. Now, hotel rooms were usually no more than bedchambers with occasional attached sitting rooms. They contained no cooking facilities, since the work of food preparation had been centralized in the hotel kitchen. Likewise, the washing of clothes was taken out of the hands of guests and relocated in basement-level laundries that employed wage-working cleaners. The same went for tailoring. Now, housekeeping could not be spatially separated from the guest rooms, but it could be contracted out to chambermaids who did their work, ideally when the guests were out. Thus, the hotel's innovative new architecture of hospitality arranged space and labor in such a way as to make it unnecessary or impossible for guests to perform any sort of traditional housework. And indeed, when we look at later hotel designs, we'll see precisely the same kinds of things. The residential areas arrayed on upper floors, the sort of common functions on lower floors and in basements, and that's simply the basic orientation, the basic configuration of hotel space really across quite a few years. Now, it's worth noting that the development of the apartment building often followed the logic not of residential space, but of hospitality space. The most widely known path of apartment building development is associated with architects like Calvert Vaux and Alexander Jackson Davis. This is a path of development that generally involved taking self-sufficient household spaces and putting them all together in a single architectural envelope. So, for example, Vaux's Parisian buildings comprise 8 units that shared a common entrance and a stairway, and each unit consisted of a parlor, dining room, kitchen, bedrooms, and bath, distributed along a corridor running from front to back. The Stuyvesant Apartments of 1869, a recurrent candidate for the title of first American apartment building, also corresponded to this basic type. They comprised a 5-story building containing 16 units, each featuring a parlor, dining room, kitchen, servants' room, and 3 bedchambers. Now, while the architects of these structures often claimed in pretty bombastic terms, the great novelty of their designs, there are some limits to these claims because they didn't really undertake a major spatial innovation other than simply establishing multiple private households on a single or a split-level plan. The other approach, less well known to the apartment building, was explicitly and clearly modeled on the hotel and therefore on spaces of hospitality. The prototype was Boston's Hotel Pelham, which is usually the other most frequently cited candidate for America's first apartment house. While it was specifically designed as a residence and did not offer shelter to travelers or other transients, the Hotel Pelham's resemblance to an actual hotel went far beyond its name. Its apartments, to begin with, had no kitchens, so tenants ate together in a common dining room served by a centralized food preparation area. The building also offered laundry services, house cleaning, and room service, and its ground floor contained stores and employed a concierge and porter. Indeed, given these features, it should come as no surprise that the Hotel Pelham's architect previously worked at a firm that had designed a number of transient hotels. Now, some of the same architectural ideas that went into the Hotel Pelham were replicated in subsequent Boston apartments, including the similarly named Hotel Hamilton from 1869, the Hotel Kempton, also from 1869, the Hotel Boylston from 1870, the Hotel Agassiz from 1872, and the Hotel Cluny from 1876. Thus, the hotel was adopted as the architectural and functional basis for apartment buildings in Boston, but also in plenty of other cities. In New York, for example, the Haight House of 1871 placed in the basement a, quote, general kitchen where meals prepared by a first-class cook would be sent to each apartment. I should also note that the Haight House provided a shared steam laundry. Same thing in Washington, D.C. So, for example, the Portland Flats included a number of communal kitchens located throughout the building. The Cairo apartments of 1894 were even more like a hotel, featuring a lobby, front desk, drugstore, lounge, and reading room. Right? The building also had a large public dining room, since only a few of the apartments actually had their own kitchens. Same deal in Chicago, right? Early apartment buildings like the Ontario Flats, the Mentone, and the Argyle of 1880, 1882, and 1886 were designed with or modified to include common dining rooms, central kitchens, public parlors, and other spaces that were modeled on hotels. So in these and many other apartment buildings, we can see clearly how the logic of the hotel, right, that is, spaces designed for commercial hospitality rather than domesticity, extended to other types of very tall buildings. Now, this dramatic rearrangement of functional spaces had already resulted in some very large hotels indeed, and that same combination of rising center city rents and new construction technologies increasingly vaulted hotels ever higher into the sky. Now, to be sure, they still followed the logic of the hospitality market, right? They were maximizing profits by catering, in this case, to the wealthiest of the wealthy. This is an age of display and of conspicuous consumption, and trying to make a hotel work as an economic matter very much dependent upon these super high income people. But I should also say that there were very important symbolic considerations and frankly, matters of ego. Right? I mean, if you think of the Waldorf Astoria, right? This was a hotel that went up in two parts in 1893 and 1897. It was 13 stories tall, and it was really born of a sense of competition among elite families, among super elite families. So the idea of putting one's name, right, whether the Waldorf family, the Astor family, putting one's name on a really tall, ornate, prestigious, elegant luxury hotel was seen as sort of a really big gesture that you could make in the landscape if, again, you were one of those super elite kinds of families that could actually imagine organizing the financing of something as big as that Waldorf Astoria. But then, of course, there's the addition of new technologies, especially, needless to say, structural steel, right, that allows these kinds of buildings, these tower hotels, to go even higher. So if you think of the LaSalle Hotel in Chicago, there's a photograph here of it under construction. It was completed in 1908. It was a 22-story hotel, very tall indeed, and it actually had 1,000 rooms. Not that many hotels had gone over that number, but it certainly did. And again, did so by not arraying them over space, but vertically in height. I should also say that this was an age of hotels that were so elegant and so ornate that even more than a century later, they are often still among the most elite and prestigious hotels in their cities. If you think of the Plaza Hotel, which was built, completed in 1907, and is still like an address that people talk about, like, oh, the Plaza Hotel. You're having tea at the Plaza Hotel. What an amazing place to be and what an amazing place to live. But that's just right in New York. You could also cite Philadelphia's Bellevue Stratford Hotel that was built in 1904. You could cite San Francisco's Fairmont Hotel, completed in 1907, as places that were built so opulently that, again, a century later, they still serve as that sort of high mark of hotel luxury in their respective cities. Now, I think it's also worth noting that these hotels again serve the wealthy at a time of just unprecedented wealth, but also unprecedented inequality and fairly widespread poverty. Right, that's sort of the amount of the total wealth held by the upper 1% was so high then that it was not matched for more than 100 years. It's of course been surpassed now, but again, sort of the emphasis on luxury was both paying a lot of attention to wealth and very much ignoring most of the rest of the population. Now, the tall luxury hotel variant was not the only route to skyscraper hotels. There was another path that was demonstrated by E.M. Statler. Now, Statler got his start in 1876 when he worked as a bellboy in a hotel in Wheeling, West Virginia. He gradually moved himself up to the sort of managerial level and then pretty soon took off and began to manage establishments on his own. He was very much into restaurants, lunchrooms, clubs, billiard parlors, and other varied forms of commercial hospitality. But he got his really big break as a hotel keeper in 1900 when he won the concession to build and keep a hotel for the Buffalo Pan American Exposition. And then again, he repeated the same process in 1904 for the Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis. And in both cases, he built and managed temporary hotels that were designed just for the sort of massive influx of people to those particular events. But he thought that he saw certain principles of hotel keeping and certain kinds of economies that he could use to work sort of a different kind of hotel on a more permanent basis. And he put those ideas to work in his first hostelry, the Buffalo Statler, which opened its doors in 1908. Now, what Statler did was to seek savings in a whole variety of ways with the hope of passing those savings along, as they say, to his customers and attracting a lot of them. That was sort of that kind of economy of scale was very much a part of his plan. So, for example, he sited this hotel not on the main street of the city, but just a couple of blocks away. The land costs were still high, but much lower than they would have been on the main street. If you look at the building, it's relatively plain compared to hotels that were its contemporaries, thus requiring a lot less labor, materials, and creating certain kinds of savings. He did things like use the same style of carpet on every single floor rather than having sort of a variety of them. He decided he could drive the unit price down by just buying one sort, and he did that. He provided bathrooms in every room, which was not necessarily a universal practice, and that was expensive, but he tried to defray those costs by putting the bathrooms back to back to share a single wet wall and a single plumbing shaft. And then more broadly, if you look at the floor plans, each floor was composed of the same sized rooms, just repeated over and over and over and over. And indeed, the same floor plan was similarly repeated over floor after floor above floor above floor. And so the aggregate result of this was something that he made into a slogan. He said, "I'll offer you a bed and a bath for $1.50." Now this approach worked, right? The Buffalo Statler was highly successful, and he used the same basic principles for a whole chain of hotels, including the Cleveland Statler of 1912, the Detroit Statler of 1915, the St. Louis Statler of 1917, the New York Statler of 1919, another Buffalo Statler in 1923, and a Boston Statler in 1927. And as you can see, he took the basic building form of the Skyscraper Hotel and just repeated it again and again in different cities in the same way that he'd repeated rooms and repeated floors. Now, this approach did have its discontents, right? Some patrons and some critics complained that his hotels were too uniform, too repetitive, too standardized. But he was really unmoved by these kinds of arguments. As long as his hotels were the best, he responded, there's nothing wrong with standardization. And indeed, Statler standardized the tall hotel tower as a basic architectural type of both hotel and of skyscraper. But remember that his primary motivation was not really about architecture or prestige, or at least the way that he described his primary motivation. Right? He said, if I wanted to, I could run a so-called luxury hotel or a resort hotel, but I don't operate in that field. To hell with it, I'm not interested in it. Mine will be at a price that ordinary people can afford. Now, this approach was so influential that as early as 1917, even the manager of the Waldorf Astoria, right, a hotel that had represented the ne plus ultra of luxury and extravagance, right, even that hotel keeper was enthusiastically repeating Statler's mantra of standardization and efficiency. And by the 19-teens, hotel designers had come around to making cost effectiveness an even higher priority than before. By the time of his death in 1928, Statler was universally regarded as the most respected hotel keeper in America, and even decades later, right, in mid-century, hotel executives that were surveyed by one industry publication named him what they called, quote, the hotel man of the half century. So looking at this, you can get a sense that that phrase, stack 'em high and sell 'em cheap, that was originally coined to describe goods, right, sold in retailing, but it could easily have been used years earlier to describe this increasingly influential approach to hotel building. You might also understand the rise of E.M. Statler and his approach to hotel keeping as an application of Fordist principles to commercial hospitality. And in fact, there were quite a few parallels between the two. Henry Ford had, of course, taken the automobile, which just 10 years before his introduction of the Model T had been a consumer item that was produced in limited numbers at great expense and intended as primarily a plaything of the rich. And through mass production and very methodical cost cutting, had made it into a much more affordable item that could be afforded ultimately by the masses, including his own workers. By the same token, when E.M. Statler used standardization of everything from food to carpets to plumbing to drive down the price of a hotel room, his sort of famous a bed and a bath for $1.50 kind of slogan indicated that it too was an effort to create a more affordable, more small d democratic kind of industry. And indeed, the resemblances were not simply coincidental. Both of these men were influenced by the same industrial imperatives that influenced so many other aspects of American life at the time, and indeed, they were friends. They corresponded, had a lot in common, though thankfully not Ford's fascist political tendencies. And I should also say that it was no accident that the very first Statler hotel that opened, the Buffalo Statler in 1908, opened its doors the very same year as that first Model T rolled off the assembly lines in Michigan. Now, it was also by no means a coincidence that the rise of the automobile as the modal form of transportation for a greater and greater number of Americans tended to dramatically change the overall trajectory of the hotel industry. The tendency was no longer going to be ever taller hotel skyscrapers. The overall direction was no longer going to be ever greater numbers of people stacked taller upon given parcels of real estate as a way of defraying the high land costs. Instead, what you were going to see was a gradual peripheralization. Now, this was driven by, again, the advent of the automobile. It allowed people to sort of approach or leave cities on their own schedules and to stop at their own choice of stopping place, so that instead of building ever taller hotels at the center of cities, the new way to create a manageable economy for hotels was to create a new type of commercial accommodation, and that is to say, the motor hotel or the motel. So hotel keepers increasingly built new hostelries at the periphery of cities, taking advantage of the low land costs to make things overall more affordable. Now, this, I should say, was pretty much representative of a lot of the economy, as we know from urban and metropolitan history, as we know from the history of business and economics, the gradual relocation of a great many sectors of the economy, from entertainment to manufacturing to retailing, from the center to the edge, was just one of the big trends of the 20th century. Indeed, it's often summed up by phrases like from city center to suburban location. I should say, though, that this does not mean that this was the end of the Skyscraper hotel. It was certainly the case that for at least a couple of decades after, architects continued to design and builders continued to construct ever taller skyscraper hotels. If you look at Schultz and Weaver's 1931 Waldorf Astoria in New York City, that was a super tall skyscraper hotel par excellence. And I should also say that if you broaden the time frame and the geography, you certainly can see other tendencies that can lead us to believe that the age of the skyscraper hotel has by no means ended. Right? If you look at anything from the Courtyard Residence Inn in Central Park or on Central Park in New York City, if you look at the Four Seasons in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, one of the world's tallest hotels, if you look at the Burj Al Arab in Dubai, or in a very different way, if you look at the Ryugyong Hotel in Pyongyang, North Korea, you see that whether driven by economic need and land costs, or whether increasingly driven by the desire to convey metropolitan prosperity or national prestige, the skyscraper hotel is still very much with us and should be for the foreseeable future. Thank you so much.